There is a kind of man who is very difficult to break, not because he is stronger than everyone else, not because he never feels fear, and not because life has been kind to him. Actually, it's almost the opposite. He's been disappointed, he's been rejected, he's lost people, he's failed. He's had moments where he questioned himself, but something happened through all of that. He stopped needing life to go his way, and that changes everything. Because the moment you stop needing people to approve of you, you become harder to manipulate. The moment you stop needing everything to be comfortable, you become harder to intimidate. And the moment you stop needing a particular outcome, you become much more dangerous in the best possible sense. You can finally act. That's what I mean by an unbreakable man. He's not a man without weakness. He's a man who has learned how to live without constantly obeying his weaknesses. And I think this is one of the great misunderstandings about strength. People think strength means having more money, more status, more attention, more women, more followers, more possessions. But sometimes strength comes from the opposite, from needing less. Because the more things you need, the more things can control you. If I need your approval, you control me. If I need you to love me, you control me. If I need everyone to respect me, you control me. If I need to win every argument, you control me. If I need my career to succeed immediately, you control me. And if I need life to be fair before I can be happy, then life controls me. So one of the first principles of becoming psychologically unbreakable is very simple. Need less. Not because you don't want anything, but because you don't want anything badly enough to betray yourself for it. There's a difference. You can have ambition without desperation. You can want love without begging for it. You can want money without allowing money to determine your identity. You can want success without becoming psychologically destroyed by failure. That's a much higher level of strength. Because when you don't desperately need something, you can finally see it clearly. Think about relationships. A man who desperately needs a woman to stay with him will behave very differently from a man who loves her but knows he can survive without her. The first man is constantly checking. Is she still interested? Why didn't she text me? Who is she talking to? Did I do something wrong? Does she still find me attractive? And slowly, without realizing it, his entire emotional state is being controlled by another person. The second man can care deeply and still remain grounded. He can say, I want you in my life, but I don't need to destroy myself to keep you. That's confidence. And it applies everywhere. The unbreakable man doesn't say, I don't care. That's often just another form of weakness. He says, I care, but I can survive the outcome. That's a completely different psychology. And if you look at history, some of the most resilient people understood this. They didn't build their lives around avoiding pain. They built their lives around becoming capable of carrying it. That's an important distinction because you cannot build a powerful life by constantly asking, how do I avoid suffering? At some point, you have to ask, how much can I handle? That's the question that changes a person. How much rejection can I handle? How much uncertainty can I handle? How much loneliness can I handle? How much failure can I handle? How much criticism can I handle without abandoning my path? Because life is going to test you. You don't get to negotiate that. You can be talented and still fail. You can be kind and still get betrayed. You can work hard and still lose. You can love someone and still lose them. You can make the right decision and still suffer the consequences. So the goal isn't to create a life where nothing bad happens. The goal is to become the kind of person who can absorb what happens and continue moving. That's what makes someone difficult to break. And I think fear is one of the biggest obstacles here. People often think courage means you don't feel fear. That's not courage. If you're never afraid, there's nothing courageous about what you're doing. Courage is feeling the fear and deciding that it doesn't get to make the decision. You can be terrified and still walk forward. You can be uncertain and still make the phone call. You can be rejected and still approach the next opportunity. You can lose everything you thought defined you and still say, okay, well, what do I do now? That sentence is incredibly powerful. What do I do now? Because weak thinking gets trapped in the past. Why did this happen? Why did she leave? Why did they betray me? Why didn't I succeed? Why wasn't I respected? Why did they choose somebody else? Why wasn't I given the opportunity? And maybe those questions are understandable, but eventually they become a prison. The unbreakable man eventually asks a different question. What do I do now? That's future-oriented thinking. And it's one of the greatest psychological advantages you can develop because the past is information. It is not a residence. You can visit it. You can study it. You can learn from it, but you cannot live there. And yet so many people spend years living inside one moment, a breakup from 5 years ago, a humiliation from school, a business failure, something their father said, something their mother didn't say, a friend who betrayed them, a person who rejected them. They keep replaying it. And every time they replay it, they give that event another piece of their life. At some point, you have to say, it happened. Now what? That's how you begin taking your power back. And this is where another principle comes in, fearless. Again, that doesn't mean becoming fearless. It means becoming less obedient to fear because fear has an interesting quality. The more you obey it, the larger it becomes. You avoid the difficult conversation. So next time the conversation becomes even harder, you avoid approaching people. So your social anxiety becomes stronger. You avoid taking risks. So your world becomes smaller. You avoid failure. So eventually you become terrified of even trying. Fear grows through avoidance and confidence grows through exposure. That's why repetition is so powerful. You don't become confident by thinking about confidence. You become confident by repeatedly doing things that used to intimidate you. The first time you fail, it feels enormous. The second time, it's painful. The third time, you begin realizing, wait, I'm still here. And that realization is incredibly important. You survived, you were rejected, you're still alive. You failed, you're still alive. You embarrassed yourself, you're still alive. You lost money, you're still alive. Someone walked away, you're still alive. And slowly something changes. You stop treating every negative event like the end of your identity. That's psychological freedom. And I think this is where men often misunderstand resilience. They think they need to become harder, more aggressive, more dominant, more emotionally detached. But sometimes becoming unbreakable actually means becoming more flexible. A tree that refuses to bend eventually breaks. The tree that can move with the storm survives. That's the same with human beings. You have to be able to change your strategy without changing your principles. You can lose a job without losing yourself. You can lose a relationship without losing yourself. You can lose money without losing yourself. You can lose status without losing yourself. And that's because your identity is not attached to one external thing. This is one of the most dangerous traps in life when a man builds his entire identity around one achievement. I am successful because I have this job. I am valuable because this woman loves me. I am important because people respect me. I am somebody because I have money. I am powerful because I'm winning. Then eventually life tests that identity. And when the external thing disappears, he doesn't just lose the thing, he loses himself. The stronger man builds something deeper. He says, these things are part of my life. They are not the foundation of my existence. That's why he can lose and rebuild. And rebuilding is one of the great skills of life. You will probably have to rebuild yourself several times after failure, after heartbreak, after financial problems, after career changes, after disappointment, after losing someone, after realizing that the person you thought you were isn't the person you actually want to become. And that's okay. A life doesn't have to be one straight line. Sometimes you have to destroy an old version of yourself, not because that version was worthless, but because it has finished its purpose. Think about the man who spent 10 years trying to become successful in one career, then he fails. He could say, I wasted 10 years. Or he could say, I spent 10 years learning discipline, communication, research, relationships, and how the world works. Now, what can I build with those skills? Same experience, completely different interpretation. That's the power of perspective. And this is why failure can sometimes be more valuable than success. Success can lie to you. It can make you think, understand everything. Failure forces you to ask, what did I misunderstand? And that question is much more useful. A successful man may become arrogant. A failed man who learns may become dangerous because now he understands his limits. He knows where he was naive He knows what he overlooked, he knows what he needs to change, and he doesn't have to repeat the same mistake. That's how failure becomes education. But there is another level to this. You have to learn how to outlast people, not by destroying them, not by competing with everyone, but by developing patience. Because most people quit too early. They want immediate evidence that what they're doing is working. They start the business. 2 months later, nothing happens. They quit. They start exercising 3 weeks later. They don't look different. They quit. They start learning a skill. 6 months later, they're not exceptional. They quit. They start building something. Nobody notices they quit. And then they look at someone who has been doing something for 10 years and say, hey, he's lucky, maybe. But often what you're calling luck is simply endurance that you didn't witness. You didn't see the years when nobody cared. You didn't see the failures. You didn't see the boring repetition. You didn't see the days when he wanted to quit. You only saw the result. That's why patience is such an underrated form of power. The ability to keep going when there is no applause, that's rare. And rare things become valuable. So if you want to become difficult to break, stop asking only, how can I become better? Start asking, how can I become harder to stop? Those are different questions. Becoming better might mean learning a skill. Becoming harder to stop means developing discipline. It means learning how to work when you're not inspired. It means learning how to continue when you're bored. It means learning how to continue when nobody is watching. Because motivation is unreliable. You cannot build your life around feeling motivated every morning. Some days you will feel powerful. Some days you will feel exhausted. Some days you'll believe in yourself. Some days you'll question everything. The unbreakable person doesn't depend entirely on emotion. He has systems. He has habits. He has standards. He knows what he does regardless of how he feels. And this is where discipline becomes freedom. People think discipline is restriction, but real discipline gives you more freedom. If you can't control your impulses, you're not free. If anger controls you, you're not free. If lust controls you, you're not free. If social approval controls you, you're not free. If your phone controls your attention, you're not free. If money controls your decisions, you're not free. If fear controls your actions, you're not free. Freedom isn't doing whatever you feel like doing. Freedom is being able to decide what you will do despite what you feel. That's a much deeper definition. And once you understand that, you begin to see why needing less is so powerful. Because every unnecessary dependency is another chain. You don't need everyone to understand you. You don't need everyone to like you. You don't need to win every argument. You don't need to respond to every insult. You don't need to prove yourself to people who have already decided what they think about you. And you don't need to chase people who have decided to walk away. This doesn't mean becoming cold. It means becoming selective. There is an enormous difference. A weak man reacts to everything. A strong man decides what deserves his energy. That is another form of power. Attention is a resource. Your emotional energy is a resource. Your time is a resource. And if you spend all of it reacting to people, you have very little left to build your own life. Someone insults you. You spend 3 days thinking about it. Someone doesn't text you back. You spend the whole night analyzing it. Someone succeeds. You become jealous. Someone criticizes you. You become defensive. Someone disagrees. You need to prove them wrong. Look at how much of your life can disappear into reactions. The unbreakable man learns to pause. He asks, is this worth my energy? Sometimes the answer is yes. Most of the time it isn't. And that pause creates enormous power because between the event and your reaction is a small space. Inside that space is your freedom. Someone can insult you. You can't control that, but you can control whether you spend the next 6 hours destroying yourself over it. Someone can reject you. You can't control that, but you can control whether rejection becomes a permanent belief about your worth. Someone can betray you. You can't control their character, but you can control what you learn from it. That's the philosophy. You cannot control everything that happens to you, but you can become much more difficult to control through what happens to you. And eventually you begin to understand something uncomfortable. Life is not going to stop testing you. You don't graduate from difficulty. You simply become more capable of handling it. The problems change. When you're young, it's one thing, then it's money, then relationships, then career, then family, then aging, then mortality. There is always something. So don't build your happiness around the fantasy that one day everything will finally become perfect. That day probably doesn't exist. Instead, build a character that can find meaning inside imperfect circumstances. That's much more powerful. And this is where purpose matters. Because if your life is only about comfort, then discomfort will destroy you. But if your life is connected to something larger than comfort, you can tolerate enormous difficulty. A man raising his children can tolerate things that would destroy a selfish man. A man building something meaningful can work through years of uncertainty. A man fighting for a cause can endure rejection. A man obsessed with mastering his craft can tolerate boredom. Purpose changes your relationship with suffering. You stop asking, why is this happening to me? And start asking, what can this suffering make me capable of? That's a completely different mindset. And perhaps this is the deepest principle of becoming unbreakable. You must learn to use what happens to you. Don't waste pain. If you are rejected, learn. If you fail, learn. If someone betrays you, learn. If you lose money, learn. If you embarrass yourself, learn. If you experience loneliness, learn. If you become afraid, learn. Turn experience into wisdom. That's the alchemy of character. The event itself is only one part of the story. The meaning you extract from it becomes the other part. Two men can experience the same failure. One becomes bitter, the other becomes wiser. Same event, different man. And that's why I don't believe the goal of life is to avoid being broken, because everyone gets broken in some way. Everyone eventually encounters something they weren't prepared for. The question is what happens afterward. Do you become smaller, or do you rebuild? Do you become more afraid or more capable? Do you become bitter or wiser? Do you become obsessed with what you lost or curious about what you can still create? That's the real test. And perhaps that's why some men seem almost impossible to destroy. They've already accepted something most people spend their lives avoiding. Everything can change, people leave, money disappears, bodies age, careers end, reputations change, circumstances collapse, eventually even life itself ends. And strangely, accepting that doesn't make you weaker. It can make you more alive, because once you understand that your time is limited, you stop wasting so much of it trying to control everything. You start paying attention. You start appreciating ordinary things, a conversation, a morning, a book, a friend, your health, your work, the ability to wake up and begin again. And that's another paradox. The man who accepts that he could lose everything often becomes the man who is most capable of building something, because he isn't paralyzed by the possibility of loss. He knows he can rebuild. That's confidence at its deepest level. Not, nothing bad will happen to me, but whatever happens, I'll figure something out. That sentence is worth developing. Whatever happens, I'll figure something out. I don't know exactly how. I don't know when. I don't know what it will look like, but I'll figure something out. That's how you need less. That's how you fear less. That's how you outlast people. And that's how you become difficult to break, not because life becomes easier, but because you become stronger than the conditions you once believed you needed. So if you're going through something right now, don't immediately ask, how do I make this pain disappear? Ask a different question. What is this trying to teach me? If you've lost someone, what did the relationship teach you? If you've lost money, what did the failure reveal? If you've been rejected, what did you discover about yourself? If you've been humiliated, what part of your ego was exposed? If you're afraid, what would happen if you stopped obeying the fear? And if your life isn't where you want it to be, don't ask, why am I so far behind? Ask, what is the smallest thing I can do today that moves me forward? Because that's how mountains are climbed, not by staring at the top. One step, then another, and eventually you look back and realize you've traveled farther than you thought. That's the philosophy of the unbreakable man. Need less, fear less, learn from everything, protect your attention, build discipline, stay future-oriented, choose a purpose bigger than your comfort. And when life knocks you down, don't waste all your energy asking why you fell. Get up, look around, learn what happened, and then ask the only question that really matters. What do I do now? because life will test you. People will disappoint you. Circumstances will change. You will lose things. You will fail. You will experience fear. There is no philosophy that can remove that, but there is a philosophy that can change what those experiences do to you. And maybe that's what real strength is, not becoming a man who never falls, becoming the man who knows that falling is not the end, not becoming a man who never needs anything, becoming a man who refuses to be owned by what he needs, not becoming a man who never feels fear, becoming a man who feels fear and walks forward anyway, and not becoming a man who never loses, becoming the man who can lose something and still remain himself. Because if you can do that, you have something far more valuable than success. You have yourself. And as long as you still have yourself, you can rebuild almost anything. There is another level of strength that most people don't understand. It's the ability to walk away, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand what your dignity is worth. A lot of men spend their lives trying to holding on to relationships that are already dead, holding on to friendships that have become one-sided, holding on to jobs that slowly destroy them, holding on to people who have already made it clear that they don't value them, and they call it loyalty. Sometimes it's not loyalty. Sometimes it's fear, fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear that they won't find someone better, fear that they won't get another opportunity. And that's where needing less becomes incredibly powerful. Because when you know you can walk away, your entire psychology changes. You don't have to threaten anyone. You don't have to announce that you're leaving. You don't have to prove that you have options. You simply know internally, I can leave if this violates who I am. That's freedom. And I think one of the hardest lessons for a man to learn is that not everything deserves to be saved. Some relationships are lessons. Some opportunities are distractions. Some people are temporary. Some doors close because you're supposed to stop standing in front of them. But we have this strange tendency as human beings to keep trying to revive things that have already died. We say, maybe they'll change. Maybe she'll come back. Maybe they'll finally appreciate me. Maybe one more conversation will fix everything. Sometimes it will, but sometimes you're not fighting for the relationship anymore. You're fighting against reality, and reality eventually wins. The strong man learns to recognize that. He doesn't confuse persistence with desperation. Persistence means continuing when something is difficult but meaningful. Desperation means continuing because you're terrified of what happens if you stop. Those look similar from the outside. Inside, they're completely different, and you can feel the difference. There's another thing that makes a man difficult to break. He becomes comfortable with being alone, not isolated, not bitter, not antisocial. Alone, there's a difference. If you cannot sit alone with your own thoughts, you become dependent on distraction. You need your phone. You need entertainment. You need people around you. You need constant stimulation. You need someone texting you. You need someone validating you. And then you never actually meet yourself. That's dangerous because eventually you discover that you're surrounded by people, but you don't know who you are. Solitude changes that. When you're alone, you start hearing things you were able to ignore when the world was loud. You notice what you actually want. You notice what you're afraid of. You notice where you're lying to yourself. You notice which relationships you're keeping because you're afraid of loneliness. You notice which ambitions are actually yours and which ones were given to you by society. That's why solitude can be uncomfortable. It removes the audience. And when there is no audience, you have to ask, who am I when nobody is watching? That's a serious question. Because a man can build an impressive public identity while privately being completely lost. He can have money, he can have status, he can have women, he can have followers, he can have a beautiful lifestyle and still be terrified of sitting in a quiet room. Why? Because everything external was protecting him from himself. The unbreakable man eventually becomes comfortable in that room. He doesn't need to escape every uncomfortable thought. He studies it. He asks, why does this bother me? Why do I need this person's approval? Why does this rejection hurt so much? Why am I jealous? Why am I angry? Why am I afraid of being ordinary? And that's where self-knowledge begins. Not when you discover everything wonderful about yourself, But when you're willing to look at the parts of yourself you don't like, your envy, your insecurity, your arrogance, your need for recognition, your desire for revenge, your fear of being insignificant, your tendency to blame other people. You don't become powerful by pretending those things don't exist. You become powerful by understanding them. Because anything you refuse to examine can eventually control you. And this is why emotional control is so important. People misunderstand emotional control. They think it means becoming emotionless. It doesn't. If anything, the strongest people often feel extremely deeply. The difference is that they don't allow every emotion to become an instruction. You can feel anger without acting angry. You can feel jealousy without becoming cruel. You can feel fear without running. You can feel sadness without destroying your life. You can feel attraction without becoming obsessed. That's emotional maturity. And emotion is information. It is not necessarily in order. Your mind says, destroy him. You don't have to. Your ego says, prove yourself. You don't have to. Your fear says, run. You don't have to. Your insecurity says, text her again. You don't have to. You can pause. And that pause is where strength lies. Because most people don't actually choose their reactions. They experience an emotion and immediately obey it. Someone insults them. They insult back. Someone ignores them. They chase. Someone rejects them. They beg. Someone succeeds. They become jealous. Someone criticizes them. They become defensive. Someone threatens their status. They attack. It's automatic. And anything automatic can be manipulated. If I know exactly what makes you angry, I can control you. If I know exactly what makes you insecure, I can control you. If I know exactly what you fear losing, I can control you. So emotional independence isn't just about feeling better. It's about becoming harder to manipulate. And this is where silence becomes powerful. You don't have to answer everything. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to defend every decision. You don't have to correct every misunderstanding. Sometimes the strongest response is no response. Not because you're playing games, but because you understand that attention is valuable. Think about how much energy people waste trying to control how they're perceived. They want everyone to understand their intentions. They want everyone to know they're a good person. They want everyone to know they were right. They want everyone to know what really happened. But here's the uncomfortable truth. People are going to misunderstand you. Some people are going to dislike you. Some people are going to tell stories about you that aren't true. Some people will judge you based on 5 seconds of information. You cannot control that. And if you spend your life trying to correct every perception, you'll never have time to build anything. The stronger position is, I know who I am. I know what I'm doing. The people who matter will eventually understand. And if they don't, you continue. That's difficult. Because the ego wants witnesses. It wants recognition. It wants everyone to admit you were right. But life doesn't always give you that. Sometimes you have to do the right thing and never receive credit. Sometimes you have to leave a relationship and be called the villain. Sometimes you have to start over and watch people who doubted you laugh. Sometimes you have to build quietly for years before anyone notices. That's where patience becomes a weapon, not against other people, against your own impatience. Because your impatience wants evidence now, it wants results now, it wants recognition now, it wants the transformation now. But some things simply take time. A body takes time to build, a reputation takes time to build, a company takes time to build, trust takes time to build, character takes time to build, mastery takes time. And if you're constantly checking whether you've arrived, you'll become frustrated before you get there. There is a better approach. Work, then work again, then work again. Let time do some of the work for you. This is one of the great secrets of long-term success. Compounding, not just financially. Everything compounds. Your habits compound, your reputation compounds, your knowledge compounds, your relationships compound, your discipline compounds. And unfortunately, your weaknesses compound too. One day of laziness doesn't destroy you, but repeated laziness becomes an identity. One lie doesn't destroy a relationship, but repeated dishonesty becomes character. One emotional reaction doesn't make you unstable, but constantly reacting becomes your personality. So you have to pay attention to what you're repeating, because repetition becomes identity. If you repeatedly keep promises to yourself, you begin trusting yourself. That's huge. A lot of men don't trust themselves. They say, I'm going to wake up early. They don't. I'm going to stop drinking. They don't. I'm going to start training. They don't. I'm going to finish this project. They don't. Eventually, their own mind stops believing them. They've broken so many promises to themselves that motivation doesn't matter anymore. But the opposite is also true. Every time you tell yourself you're going to do something and actually do it, you build self-trust. You say, I'm going to train today, and you train. I'm going to finish this chapter, and you finish it. I'm going to make that difficult call, and you make it. I'm going to stop chasing someone who doesn't value me, and you stop. Each one seems small, but you're teaching your brain, when I say something, I mean it. That's how confidence is built.
Yeah.
Not through affirmations, through evidence. You become confident because you've seen yourself handle difficult things. And that brings us back to fear. You don't eliminate fear. You collect evidence that you can survive it. That's different. Every difficult thing you do becomes another piece of evidence. I survived that. I survived that too. And I survived that. Eventually, your nervous system begins to understand, maybe this isn't as dangerous as I thought. That's how your world expands. And this is why comfort can become dangerous. Comfort isn't evil, but too much comfort makes your world smaller. If everything you do is easy, you're not developing capacity. You need resistance. You need challenges. You need situations where you're not immediately good, because being bad at something is humbling and humility is useful. When you're bad at something, you have to listen, you have to learn, you have to practice, you have to accept correction, you have to tolerate looking stupid. And that's why beginners often grow faster than people protecting their ego. A man who is terrified of looking foolish will never become exceptional, because becoming exceptional requires looking foolish first. You have to be willing to be the beginner. You have to be willing to ask stupid questions. You have to be willing to fail publicly. You have to be willing to be rejected. You have to be willing to have people say, you're not good enough, and then decide for yourself whether they're right. That's another form of independence, not allowing someone else's opinion to become your identity. Someone says you're a failure. Maybe you failed. That doesn't mean you're a failure. Someone says you're not talented. Maybe you aren't talented yet. That doesn't mean you can't become skilled. Someone says you'll never succeed. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. But either way, they don't get to decide your future. You do. And this is why the unbreakable man becomes very careful about whose opinions he respects. Not everyone deserves access to your mind. Some people criticize because they care. Some criticize because they see something you don't. Listen to them. Some criticize because they're insecure. Learn to recognize that too. Wisdom is not ignoring criticism. Wisdom is knowing which criticism contains information and which criticism is simply noise. Another thing that makes a man difficult to break is that he stops trying to win every battle. This is subtle. A weak man wants to prove his strength constantly. A strong man doesn't need to. He knows that energy is limited. There are arguments you don't need to have. There are people you don't need to convince. There are insults you don't need to answer. There are competitions you don't need to enter. And there are people you don't need to defeat. Because sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to participate. If someone wants to drag you into chaos, don't go. If someone wants to provoke you, don't give them the reaction they're looking for. If someone wants you to prove your worth, don't audition. You don't have to attend every fight you're invited to. That's one of the greatest forms of emotional discipline. And eventually you start realizing that peace is not weakness. Peace is power under control. Anyone can explode, anyone can scream, anyone can send the angry message, anyone can burn the bridge. The difficult thing is remaining composed when your ego desperately wants revenge. That's strength. And sometimes revenge is the most expensive thing you can buy because it keeps you emotionally attached to the person who hurt you. You say you hate them, but you're still thinking about them. You're still checking what they're doing. You're still imagining what you'll say if you see them. You're still trying to prove that you're better. You're still allowing them to occupy space in your mind. That's not freedom. Freedom is forgetting, not pretending it didn't happen, not forgiving because someone deserves forgiveness, but reaching the point where you no longer need anything from them. Not an apology, not recognition, not revenge, nothing. That's when the relationship truly ends. And maybe that's one of the hardest lessons in becoming unbreakable. You have to become okay with not getting closure. Sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. Sometimes people hurt you and never understand what they did. Sometimes they don't apologize. Sometimes they don't regret it. Sometimes they move on as if nothing happened. And you have to move on too, not because they deserve it, because you do. Your future is too valuable to sacrifice to someone else's past behavior. That's why the strongest men eventually become future oriented. They're always asking, what am I building next? Not what did they do to me? What am I building next? What am I learning next? Where am I going next? Who am I becoming next? That question keeps you moving, and movement is life. Stagnation is what happens when you keep looking backward. You can honor your past without worshiping it. You can remember people without needing them back. You can remember failures without living inside them. You can remember who you were without becoming that person again. And perhaps that's what maturity really is. You stop demanding that the past become different. You accept that it happened. Then you become responsible for what happens next. That's where your power begins. Because nobody can change what already happened, but you can influence what happens tomorrow. And tomorrow is where your leverage is. So if you're watching this and you're going through a difficult period right now, don't rush yourself. You don't need to pretend you're okay. You don't need to act invincible. You don't need to suppress everything. Feel it, study it, let yourself grieve, let yourself be disappointed, let yourself admit this hurts. But don't build a permanent identity around temporary pain. That's the mistake. You are going through something. You're not the thing you're going through. There's a difference. You're experiencing failure. You are not failure. You're experiencing loneliness. You are not loneliness. You're experiencing rejection. You are not rejection. You're experiencing fear. You are not fear. And if you can remember that distinction, you create distance between yourself and the experience. That distance gives you choice. Choice is power. Eventually the storm passes, not always quickly. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years, but things change. The person who broke your heart becomes a memory. The job you thought was everything becomes a chapter. The failure that embarrassed you becomes a story. The rejection that destroyed your confidence becomes something you barely remember. And you realize something. You were stronger than you thought, not because you never suffered, because you suffered and continued. That's the real definition of resilience. You kept moving. And maybe that's all an unbreakable man really is. A man who keeps moving. He doesn't always know the answer. He doesn't always feel confident. He doesn't always feel motivated. He doesn't always understand what life is doing, but he keeps moving one day, one decision, one habit, one failure, one lesson, one step, and eventually he becomes someone his younger self would barely recognize. Not because life gave him everything, but because life took things from him and he learned how to continue without them. That's strength. To need less, to fear less, to react less, to complain less, to prove less, to explain less, and to build more, learn more, create more, love more deeply, stand more firmly, and walk away when something violates your principles, because the goal isn't to become cold. The goal is to become free, free from the need to be admired, free from the fear of rejection, free from the addiction to comfort, free from the obsession with the past, free from the approval of people who don't understand you, free from the belief that one failure defines your life. And when you become free in that way, something strange happens. You become calmer, you become harder to provoke, you become harder to manipulate, you become more patient, you become more selective, you become more willing to take risks because you no longer feel like every outcome determines your worth. And that's when you become dangerous to your own limitations. You start doing things you once thought were impossible. You approach, you build, you speak, you leave, you begin again, you fail, you learn, you return, and eventually you realize that the thing you were afraid of wasn't failure. It was discovering that you could survive failure Because once you discover that, fear loses some of its power. And once fear loses its power, your life gets bigger. So don't try to create a life where nothing can hurt you. Create a character that can be hurt without being destroyed. Create a mind that can experience failure without becoming hopeless. Create a heart that can experience rejection without becoming bitter. Create a discipline that continues when motivation disappears. Create a purpose that is bigger than your comfort. And create a relationship with yourself so strong that even when everything external changes, you still know I am here. I can think, I can learn, I can rebuild, I can begin again. That is what makes a man difficult to break, not his muscles, not his money, not his status, not his ability to dominate other people, his ability to remain himself when life tries to convince him that he should become someone else. And if you can develop that you don't need life to become easy, you become capable of living through the hard parts. You don't need everyone to stay. You become capable of standing alone. You don't need every opportunity to work. You become capable of creating another one. You don't need to win every battle. You become capable of choosing which battles matter, and you don't need to know exactly what the future holds. You only need to trust that when the future arrives, you will meet it as someone stronger than the person you are today. That's the philosophy. Need less, fear less, stay patient, control your reactions, protect your attention, walk away when necessary, and keep moving. Because life can take almost anything from you. But there is one thing it cannot take unless you surrender it: your ability to decide what you become next.